How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulero Gonzalez here. In this video, I want to explore now about the hooks, what is hooks in React, and also the custom hooks, and why do we have here, right? So, to understand that, first, I'll make a quick recap of how do I get here? So by looking now at the React and understanding what React is and where React come from, what is the problem that React aims to solve for Facebook, which is now a web applications, it's a software, formerly Facebook, now Meta, which is a social network that allow you connect and talk and share via chat or their newsfeed with your friends or college or different people that you might don't even know, or perhaps stalking and do doxing and do all this nasty stuff, but also not, right? And the whole point of this is that this small web application that, like any other software, at some point they have to deal is with some of this complexity in terms of how do you now is by having different user interfaces, and all of these user interface now share is the same piece of information. How you make sure, using the traditional way of building application, which is the MVC, model view controller, but the model is pulling the data from the database, and then on the view, and then on the controller is now processing in a way that is suitable for the view, and that is what ultimately the end user will look. So on that, right? So because you have now all of this piece of information, that the same piece of information that live in all of these different model view controller, right? It becomes quite a nightmare to try to update that. Right? So you have now to update this in this model and this in another one, and this model view controller, and then this another layer, and this another layer, and this another layer. You get the idea. And so what the R&D at Facebook, formerly Facebook, now Meta, say, hey, let's want to take a look at now how we can is find a place to have one single piece of information and keep that sync with all of this, right? So we as developer, we don't have to write that piece of information uh, over and over and over on any of these components and make sure that that data is updated. It is up to this particular tool to sync that data with the UI, right? So as long as you define your particular piece of information or your state, now uh, whatever you want to use, you're guaranteed by this tool, by the framework, the library, React, that you always gonna get is the latest information to do so. So because now this also works for the web, or any platform where you need to render some user interface, for example the web, uh, the mobile with the React Native, and also with the WebLG, right? To rendering it three animations, and you have now several different primitive, right, or tags, right, for constructing these specific elements. It becomes very convenient to do so in a way that allows to build now this user interface. So how now these things actually work, so how you can create now is a particular UI that React is keep track of that. So, well, it turns out that it's like a function where you now pass some attributes in the content. So for example, the same as for the HTML, because here our priority is only on the web, not on the mobile or any other 3D landscape. It's only on the web. Uh, because this is what this course is all about. So if you remember of your HTML, that at the end of the day you're going to pass now some. So you're going to describe is which tag is this, the section, form, yada yada yada, and also the attributes as well as the content. All right. So this React function, anytime that you create an element, you pass now is this piece of information, and what you get it is a JSON object that describe now is the state at that particular moment, and this object, which is given us by React create element, is now describing that. So you have now this, you have the props, you have the key, you have the ref, as well as you have the props, key, ref, children's, all right, among other private details. But what is relevant is that this is now this representation of the UI, and this is part of the core idea of the UI of the React in itself. And also for any other applications or any other framework, when you use now a particular library or any other frameworks, so what it represents, right? What is the aim or the end goal, the end game of this tool, right? So in the case of React is to describe literally in an object what is the current state on them. So in that object, in that piece of information, you can look is that, hey, this element that you are creating, now this is the key, this is the props, this is the children, right? And by exploring now is the anatomy of this element, and the more complex the UI you want to make. So for example, not only to render list of elements or forms, but actually when it comes to provide some interactivity or bigger applications in the case like this, right? So it becomes quite tedious to every time call that create element function from React. So it turns out that the team, the React team, say, hey, you know what? It'll be much more easy to find a way to just focus on what we really care about, which is writing the HTML and the logic and the CSS, using now something called the JSX, which is a markdown language that allow now to combine is the markdown, HTML markdown, with the JavaScript, and also with CSS. So what changed now is that the traditional way of writing applications, whether using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in each separate file, so now you have everything combined into that, into some sort of spaghetti. So this is spaghetti that if you come from this traditional way of writing web apps, at the beginning it might hurt your feelings and eyes, but as you now understand why do we have this, and it's because now we have everything bundled up into one single file. So this JSX, I look at the difference between JSX with HTML, and which is, for example, the HTML forms, some attributes change, the way how do you describe the the properties and the events, in so for example now class name in HTML form, all right, and what are the difference between now is another template engines. So for example is Blade or Blade from PHP, or Shopify use a template engine from Ruby. I don't remember that right now. Doesn't matter. But again, the template engines, right? So unlike those, where they have to define their own iteration logics and conditional logics. So now here, JavaScript has that built in. So I look now at another component of the React, which is the fragments, which allows you to now is avoid to polluting the DOM by using now a React fragments to actually encapsulate a group of elements in one particular level and then append that to the DOM. And then now how you can is do basic stuff with JSX. So for example is rendering a collection of elements using now the map. And because of this is a common task, why I use now range utility and all of these functional convenient functions. So for example, range, right? So hey, I would like to now define is this set of elements in specify is a fixed length, right? Specify a threshold to now render all of these different elements in a list. So because when you rendering elements as a list using these array operations, so React doesn't have a native way to identify each one of those elements. That's what we use now, the key. So there are several ways of how you can uniquely identify keys, right? And again, let's go beyond at least of that description. I'm going to mention that later on. But the whole idea is, hey, we have now is this way of rendering elements using now the built-in method from JavaScript, which makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to now conditionally render element, which is another thing that these template engines have to create this by itself. So here with JavaScript, we already have them. So whether it's you using if or early returns or ampersands for like if statements on the template expressions, conditional expressions on like conditional statements, and the difference between a statement and an expression is that a statement is something that is going to be evaluated by the language, and an expression is it produce a value, right? So expressions are used on the markdown. So you have now if, like double ampersand, or the ternary operator, like if and else condition here, and how important it is for us to always return is a true value, not a true t value, because things can become quite interesting. Not to mention that you will ask, what the French toast is doing this? This true t value that it go a little bit beyond the scope of React, because it's now lay on the JavaScript foundation. True t and false t value is the way how JavaScript now determine is if a value is now true or false when it needs to convert from one type to another. Again, this is going to the JavaScript land, and the TLDR is that when you're working with JavaScript, when you're writing programs, so you're telling to the machine, hey, this is what I want you to do, and so on and so forth. Give me a second. Holy moly. my god. Okay. Yeah, that was a mosquito. Sorry for the interruption. Sorry for the interruption. So, uh, so now, where I was, the list and the conditions exactly, and the values is like when you are writing a program, it is important for you to understand now how to work with variables, what a program is, and what you can do in a program. So, for example, is to describe now values that they represent now a state of your applications, numbers, strings, and the different or and the way to describe those string and numbers from the computer, and booleans and symbols and big ints and objects, right? So because uh, in the case of booleans, or in the case of JavaScript, the way how now this works, do the dynamic nature, aka, so it's not a compiled language. It's going to analyze code line by line. So there is no representation. There is no binary representation of this code. Or in other words, the source code is the execution of the code, right? Unlike any compiler language, uh, where now usually the generate is now a portable binary code. So, but in any case, and anytime you're writing a program in JavaScript, it is important for you to understand how working with variables and what is how working with variables, what a variable is, which is a container of these values, and what a value means in the programs, which represent is the state of your programs, and what a program is, which is describing is a series of statements for doing things that you want to do, right? For solving problems that you want to do. Basic stuff like, hey, I would like to keep track my sleep, or my nutritions, or my fitness, or my finance, or the neighbor that is stalking me, and I'm going to put a warrant against him because it looks like he doesn't have any life, or she doesn't have any life, and X and Y and Z, you know. But the thing here is that on top of that, when I describe the this way of using programs and variables, and why I mentioned this is when you need to conditionally render elements, this expression and statement is important at least to you to understand. Why is this? Because when you started to now creating more and more complex applications, it makes a lot of sense to identify when to use this. The judgment here is very important. So speaking of judgments, and now the CSS in the GSX in it itself, and how you can now organize your program in this new particularly web development is, hey, you will have now the index, which is the entry point of your application, where now React is going to identify which elements needs to target to create all of these elements and to mount all of these user elements here. And also so this is now the index, right? Here you describe is a CSS file that you want to import here. The other is the app home, which is the base of React application. Here you describe things like context, something that I'm going to mention that later on. And then your modules, which represents now is your components. And the anatomy of your component is that, hey, you can receive now props, you can receive now children's, what a children is, which is this content that you can pass down, similar like HTML element where you pass now the content around the brackets, the ankle brackets. So you can now receive this piece of information and now render inside of that. And also, as I mentioned, I look at, or yeah, uh, I I describe the if statements, all right, and I describe as the condition, the rendering logic, the conditional statements, and also how you can now add style to your component, which is via the CSS models, which is going now into another detail on how you now generate all of these files into one into something that can be understood by the engine, which is JavaScript in itself, not GSS. So when you're writing your user interface in this markdown language, it needs to be transpiled to something that can understood by the browser, which is JavaScript. So this transpilation, unlike compilation, is just a fancy way to differentiate the process. Transpilation is when you take now a particularly high-level language, Python, Java, or anything that resemble or look like a human readable language into another human readable language. Unlike compilation or compile is that when you take now a high level language, something that you can somewhat understand, and then you generate now a portable binary execution, something that only the machine can understand. I mean, you can understand because it's purely binary code, but it will take you quite a lot of time. Or unless you are Turing or von Neumann, that you can now execute binary code in your mind, right? It's like, hey, when you it's like when you're reading Chinese or another language that at the beginning might look like weird, like Farsi. You read that, you say, oh, I get it, I get it. So this is somewhat similar to reading binary code. You say, oh, this sequence represent this, and this another one, this another one, this another one. You say, I get it. So in any case, but yeah, this is describing is the how our programs are organized in React, and when it comes to adding the styles in our components via the CSS model, which is now it takes a I'm describing is the process of transpilations and how you convert it from one to another language, which is JavaScript in this case, and also is now when you want to transform is not only the JavaScript or the JSX into JavaScript code, but also is how you can now apply CSS to your JavaScript. Okay, and because now this process is part of the bundling or the build process, because you are writing is applications on JSX. So now you have a particular tool known as Webpack or any model bundler, right? BS Build, or you name it. So this help us now take is this input or take now this code and find ways to attach those CSS selectors and make them available per components on your UI. So in other words, CSS models allow you to now defining as a CSS file with all of these selectors, which a target is HTML DOM, or you can attach those selectors to the HTML DOM via class name to look like, well, the way you want to in your UI. So this particular process, which is, or this linking process of creating now this linking process between the CSS selectors and allow you to have access as an object and put it as the CSS on this linking process of describing or getting your CSS selectors that describe the look and feel of that particular HTML tag, and then now bind that to that specific HTML tag. All right. This process is something that CSS model does. The TLDR of that is that, hey, I'm going to take now is I'm going to create now a specific selector, all right, using now a particular convention. Is like, hey, I'm going to generate a specific hash and then a component name and then the name of the selectors. So I have now this specific selector named that is going to be used by these specific elements or any elements at this component level. So why this is important? Because with traditional HTML, CSS, and JavaScript web development, you have now several methodologies in CSS of how you can now is describing these CSS selectors, and if you need somehow to use or reuse some of these CSS selectors, you use some techniques like BEM methodologies, which is block element modifiers. The TLDR is that you have now to specify is via conventions the name of the selectors, but the problem is that you need to use now names, and names is something that you might runs out very fast. Not to mention that all of these names, because they are now globally accessible, if you need to reuse some of them, it becomes some problematic here. So you are gonna have these name collisions. Again, something that goes beyond the scope of this video, but I just want to bring this up because this is how you traditionally work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript using this BEM methodology. But now in the React way, you have now the CSS model to describe CSS components, scope component or scope per component. Okay, so now this is great because this describe is the model one, and then when you want to add now some interactivity to this user interface, the way how you do that without React is, or you attach now a functionality to an event listener that is targeting a specific element, or you now call a function on that particularly event at the DOM level or at the markdown level, right? Because now in React is now doesn't work this way. You're going to pass now is a function reference that this function will be called by React. And this is the difference between now a library and a framework, something that I mentioned before, which one of the how do you put it? One of the Agile Manifesto members I don't remember his name right now. I know it will come up at some point later on. Is hey, the difference between a library and a framework is in a library you call your function directly, and a framework call your function. And this is and you may wonder, why do I even care about this? Right? Well, it's because this is the way how now React is going to respond to user events, and those events that are now is provided by the browser, so which is like a private mini investigator that track every little thing that you do. So React is going to now is call your functions for you. So this is why you pass now a handler to the React event, and then inside of this handler is when you now can provide some interactivity. So for example, is how you can now is allows to a component to update its value based on a user events. So for a basic example is a counter, right? So the counter is the basic one. That's why I understand why a lot of folks out there say that you should be able to write a counter in React, and also a timer is another one. So how you can start and stop a timer, and how you can now render is a matrix, okay, or like a tic-tac-toe games, or in this case a word game as it is, right? Why is that? Well, because this is what React is good about. This is the reason why React exists. So because now when it comes to provide some interactivity, I'll be right back. All right, and we are back. So to provide now this kind of interactivity, okay, it turns out that by passing these functions to by letting React call our functions for us, so we are now passing control to that, which is known as the inversion of control. Why this is important? Because when we're exploring is the core loop of React, the user state, which allow us to now keep track of piece of information. So when you update, oh my god. Okay. So anytime you want to update that piece of information, thanks to this hook that React exposed to us, now we do that is inside of this event handlers. So this event handlers that we pass now functions reference. So now React we're gonna call that when it's a fit. Okay, so in other words, when the user responds to that event, now it will also update that state properly, as if we want to update that state. So this idea of this core loop of React user state is that we are now able to hook into one of these React hooks, one of these internal. And you might wonder how now React actually is remember this piece of information. This is now going into the JavaScript land. Again, it goes beyond the scope of today's video, but this is quite interesting and useful for you to useful for you to understand, because it turns out that JavaScript in itself has a way of remembering piece of information via closures. So this data or this information that you want, that allows you to represent something in your program, that when you see fit is, in other words, when you call this function in a different place, you can now still have access to that information and update that as a live link. So this is what closures allow us to do, and this is a property from the function. And again, so instead of you having to keep track of that state and so on and so forth, is now React doing that for us. We can implement our own use state hook, right? And I get it why is also. I don't think this is an interview question because it goes too much into the details, and we want something that is more practical. We want more heuristic from the developers in interview questions or in interviews. Is that, hey, can you now know what the French toast is this thing doing? Okay, can you write this? So not only show me the code, show me that you can do this. So this is what use state is. Allows to hook in onto the React internals to do specific stuff, which is remember data. Okay, so now once I look at how to do that and how does it work, is by putting now in motion these inner mechanisms. So React, anytime that you update that state inside of your function handler, is going to now is set in motion is this three phase: the trigger, the render, and the commit phase. So the trigger is detecting which component actually now trigger that state update, and then it's going to call that component and all the subsequent components from that React component, all right, until there is no more components, aka recreating now is a new state of the UI, and this new state of the UI known as the virtual DOM is now compared with the old ones to apply only the bare minimum necessary change to the DOM. So this process of figuring out the new state of the UI is known as the rendering or the render. Unlike computer graphics, when now rendering is now taking an unprocessed raw inputs and then generate a new one or output, usually from 3D models to the image. In the case of rendering, React is spotting the difference between these two snapshots, these two, generating the new state of the UI, and then spot the difference to now apply those small changes to the DOM. This is known as the commit phase. So when the browser detects those DOM updates, it's going to now re-render that piece of UI on the screen. So all of this is the core loop, right, of React. Now, I look at how to use that in when it comes to update your state, how this updates is now asynchronous. It happens on the next rendering, and you can batch multiple state updates in one single go. So this is now part of the convenient way of using this specific tool to remember data for ourselves, and then keep track of that data and have a live link to that, right? And then now update the UI properly when we see when we need it. So this is good for the use state hook, and then is that all right? So, but when it comes to deal with some another common task on UI web development is to not only render list of elements, but also is to handle form inputs, to collect data and to process that and then send it back to the backends to do some data processing. And let's say you want to store now some data, and that data is stored on a database, and then further down the line you want to do some you want to get some insight from that data, or do some heavy intense data analysis from that data, you know. uh, but it turns out that this is it, right? So, but again, in the case of React, we need to deal with forms, and forms, because all of this input has different ways to collect or to respond to data and then show that, for example, via selects or input type is tell date, cell phone, date, text, range, versus the radio and checkboxes in the text area. So because this different type of inputs has specific way to collect this data and then to update that. So React say no. Let's going to create now a unified way to collect this data via the onChange, and then update the value via the value property. But unlike, except for radio and checkboxes, right? Because at the end of the day, the way you update this value is via the check attribute, and you want to respond to that via the onChange, which is something that I mentioned, or that I let me see, is something that I did here. And I did here is by looking at this, right? And for example, is this the data binding as it is, and exactly, it's describing, for example, like this control versus uncontrolled inputs, right? So, but the TLDR of this, right, is that now this is a very interesting example of how to see if you know what the French toast you are doing. There was another one which is not only the two-factor authentication, to see how you can check that and respond to that, which I do find quite revealing. And this one, that was quite interesting, to see how you can now respond to several different inputs, so like range, or select, or even here, and the nuance of this, right? But as you can see here, whether if you're using a type range, the format is the same, or if you're using now the select, for example, the color theme like this, if you're using now a select, the format is the same, right? Or this pattern is the same. You want to collect this data from value and onChange. But when it comes to look at the inputs, radio buttons like this, type radio, right? Now, if you want to select that to improve the usability here, not only that you need to set is the name of that input as the label as it is, but what it is, shape, input, circles, and polygon, exactly. So not only that the ID must match with the HTML form from that label, so now the browser can detect that, okay? But also is we have here kind of the this is on circle, that's right. So here we have is the value, We also detect that change on change, but if we want to set that values is via the check here as expected, right? Uh, so this shape is something that we define here now as a piece of state, as a piece of information, right? Like the shape, if this is circle, so for example, the shape accepted values are circles and polygons. So you define this as a way to keep track of this piece of information. And if this is a circle, all right, it makes a lot of sense. So it becomes now a pattern here. Hey, if the shape is circle, it means that this is true. So I do want you to check that. If this is now polygon, is a state if this is polygon. So when you get that value from the onChange, right? This is why we set here the value and the value here in circles and polygon. So when we get that value out of this, we can now match that as expected and verify if they have the same, right? So when we respond to the user event, is it is. So why I mention it, why I hit the brake to describe this, because this is a common theme in collecting data from the user via forms. So radio buttons and checkboxes are one common way to do that. It is sometimes got, it is what it is, man, right? So, and they have a specific way to get that data in a particular pattern, because this indeed becomes now a pattern. So anytime that you define here is radio buttons like this, and then you want to collect which group is it belongs to actually now provide the proper interactivity. So this particular pattern, whether it's for checkboxes or radio buttons, right? If you only want to select just one from a multiple selections, there is a particular pattern to do so. So which is as I describe here, right? So not only that you put the label and the input, and then you bind that via the HTML form, the name of that HTML via the ID of that input checkbox on radio. You set now the value to that as a string, because you want to now get that when the user interact to that, and then update the state with that value. And then when React renders this, it's going to check via the check attribute if that is the proper one. All right, is that value match the radio button? Because it does when you interact with that. So now it's set that as true. So yeah, pretty basic stuff, and things that any JavaScript developers that work with React or any other framework, particularly with React, must know how to create this small user interface. There is a main thing among other developers in the developer community on Twitter. I wish them the best, that people at Twitter. Anyway, it's a Sue that hey, so they say I don't know how to interact with this, and they don't actually kind of grasp the main idea behind working with React, and why React is useful and when to do that. I do see the value of learning this by truly understand what is the problems that you want to do, and this desire of understanding what is the problem, whatever it is, whatever it come from, right? But if the desire is there, it a lot of the time make not only this specific field of software very interesting, but also lucrative. So in any case, this is how you can now, this is the pattern for collecting data from radio buttons and checkboxes. Okay, the another pattern to collect and show data to select, like this. All right, so here I am rendering is a collection of elements here, and when the user interact to this, I'm going to detect that and update the proper value to match that, and this value, the color theme, will be now the options there, all right, inside of the select, and then I'm going to render these collections of values. And the same for the radio input, which is you say, hey, I do want to know anytime the user interact with this, so get me is the value from that, and in the case of the input, it goes from 1 to 50. So give me is the value of this, and even though I can even expand this a little bit by saying, hey, this is 30, right? And then and of course you're gonna see, you won't see 30, you won't see up to 20, something like that, 20ish. I can even now reduce the range here. You can see, so now it actually so I define the range here of this input. So this is now the input range, and how the things work. Let me put it where it was. There you go. So this is now the input text as is, right? So yeah, this is just to describe basically what are the common inputs that we can use that are common on the web development to collect data, and these collections of data, whether if you do that control or uncontrolled of this input, aka you are now letting reactively to control is the data binding, or not. Okay, when you write your forms, you use now onSubmit usually to collect all of this data, and depend of the input type, you might say, hey, I don't want to use this, depend of the UI. Okay, hey, I don't want to define is now an state for each one of those inputs, right, in a specific form. I just want to let the browser handle that for me. So on the submit, you say, hey, give me is now the event target, which contains the DOM of that form, and they now convert it into a, which is something that I define here. I think it is. Let me now convert that. Yeah, this is a small thing. Let me see if I can. This is useful for several of inputs. Let me see if I have several inputs here. Right. So this is a good example. Oh, in this case, exactly. So let's go to now prevent is the behavior by default, because anytime that you use a form that you submit, this is something that goes even before React and before Fetch API, or even XHSR, or even JSON. All right. That by default, anytime that you submit a form, so the browser refresh that page with the piece of data that the server provide, right? So because we don't want that behavior, we want to prevent that behavior by default, but what we do is to get that value, so get that form DOM structure, okay, convert that form to get now is a specific input per name. All right, so for example, like this is again is something that is small. You might wonder, when do you want to do this? All right, it'll depend. So For example, let's say you just want to write a simple form for an onboarding process. Well, you just define all of these different inputs and define your logic. Uh, yeah, define the logic at this level here, right? So define this logic at this at the handler level. So far so good. And here, so anytime that this now is changed, so we are not letting React to actually is collect that input, right? We want to do that is after we get all of our inputs and so on and so forth. But again, if you have now an onboarding process with several forms, on each one of them you want to provide some sort of interactivity or some specific animation and so on and so forth, so it would make much sense to actually now let React to keep track of all of these different pieces of data in this interactive form. But in any case, I just mentioned this because it is part of the core of React in terms of how you capture events from the browser, and how do you now hook into React for a specific use case. How do you remember now specific data using the user state, and how this is helpful for collecting data from a forms. And those forms, whether it's you let React handle those inputs known as control input, or you just only is let the browser handle that for you and you set the validation at that level. Uh, Either way, it's just how you can now write your own forms and create all of that and so on and so forth. So, in speaking of another anatomy of the components is the prop and states. So, how now you pass props and state? What are props and states? And anytime that you need to keep track of complex data, so for example, like objects, always return is a new value out of this, right? If you are now keep tracking an object or an array, always generate is a new state out of this. You may wonder why. Well, ask yourself, how do you now make sure that in an object, whether it's a hash or whether it's a hash or a set or a collection of data, how do you make sure that in those objects, okay, you verify that let's make it simple. How do you verify that in a hash you pass now a new how do you verify between these two objects which property and key, or which key and value actually change, right? So one way to do that is by or iterating through that and figuring out what changed, and then only update that. So doing that, it required a lookup process. Okay. So if this is sorted, you can reduce that lookup process. But again, the lookup process exists, so it's time. And the other is that, hey, let's going to transform this JSON into a string, and then figuring out which strings are different. Again, it's doing is a linear search or a lookup process. So this is something that takes time. Anytime that you need to look up for something, it takes time. So the React team say, hey, instead of doing that, so please give me now is a new state of this information that you want to keep track of. All right. And I'm going to now update the React or update your UI properly. So that makes a lot of sense to actually is um, it, to always generate a new state of the piece of information, of complex piece of information, or complex states. Um, Not only that, you should avoid any mutation bugs, uh, but also is that it makes much more simple for React and for you to now always generate is a new piece of information. This is when now functional programming kicks in, and there's a book out there called Light, Functional Light on JavaScript here, from Kyle Simpson, right? Where he now elegantly describe is this concepts of Java, functional programming applied to JavaScript, right? So it is make much more easy to understand and see the benefits and see the real value, the real deal of this, right? So statement like this. So a monad is just a monoid in the category of end of functor. I don't even know what the French that means right now, but this is part of the functional life. Again, JavaScript support this way of writing programs. So in any case, so this is it, right? I mentioned it's also the complex states and how you can now, for example, is uniquely identify is IDs when you render dynamically elements via the array methods, all right? So when you, or any way to render a sequence of elements, right? So React doesn't keep track of that. So what you can do is to now define is those IDs inside of the elements, or by regenerating, whether it's using the mat.random or the crypto get random UUID, which is much more safe because they generate now numbers that are less likely to collide. It is astronomically low that happen. It might happen, but it's logarithmic, the odds that make that happen. So in any case, so yeah, this is dynamic key generation, and also when it comes to work with the state of this piece of information, where you put it matters, because now it's going to call. So when that piece of information, when you put it matters, because when you put that piece of data, Jesus. So when you put that piece of information matters, because that component is gonna be now rendered by React. So it's gonna now, so when you update that piece of data at that level, is going to now is render or call that components and generate the new state of the UI. So there is no good or wrong about this. This is now more like the way how React works. And we later on we're gonna see how to do that in a brief moment. But yeah, and now when you look at this piece of information or this state, because some of this information might be global for your applications, some of them not. And when you write products, whether it's on the SaaS, yeah, when you're building products, let's say a landing page or some that doesn't have too much state or too much information, or in contrast, some apps that are heavy on the client side, that you need to have all of this, a lot of information, but on the client side. And also when you're building now is applications on the server, right? So now the state live on the server. So for the first case, it's quite simple, it's quite straightforward. You don't need too much just to keep track of that piece of information at that level, so on and so forth. But for heavy client applications, you might need to somehow to keep track of that data in a way that is easy for us to manage. This is why we have now tools like Redux, where it say, hey, I'm going to now handle this state for you. And it follows now a particular process or architecture known as the Flux architecture, which the TLDR is that anytime that you need to update this piece of information, you're going to now define the actions that cause that state to be updated, and the reducer or the function that is going to update that state, which is creating or generating a new state of that. So with that process, anytime that somebody, in this case any component, update that piece of information global state, right? So we can know who made that, and we can debug that. So the traceability here and the observability is now there. So that makes a lot of sense, using now Redux for that. But now sometimes you need to write is this SaaS application or back office application that needs to where where the information live on the server. And you might wonder, all right, so what about that? Right? So because that the data doesn't live on the client, it's now on the server. So there's a couple of questions. So for example, is how do you now fetch the right data at the right time? Why is that? Because you don't want to show stale data to the user, so you somehow need to show is or to revalidate that piece of information, and you don't want to hammer the server. You don't want to hammer your server. You want to reduce the number of requests that specific component require, right? So somehow you need to catch that piece of information. And also sometimes you want to predict what will be the state of this network requests, so to avoid any race conditions. And also is that you want to show is a slice of information, or aka pagination. All of these issues are now network related. All right, so network problems, not a state problem. So this is why we have now solutions like SWC or GraphQL or React Query that aims that. So now Redux has also evolved to include this set of problems into its own library known as the RTK query, right? The Redux toolkit, particularly with query. So again, if you're using now an application that go with this, go it for it. You can actually add that. But the thing is that Redux is good for managing state, and then you want to enhance that functionality to handle now network related problems, where there are already other libraries out there that are helpful to do so, right? So you have now Substand, and then you have for the state management, and then you have now another libraries like Recoil or SWC and GraphQL or GraphQL and React Query, okay, to handle those specific use case. But again, all of these are network related problems. So far so good. Now it makes a lot of sense, and how all of these different pieces fits together. So here you describe here now the components instance, all right? So remember that these instances are created at the function, all right? So these elements don't create instance. Renderings create those instances. Renderings, what it creates, this is new state of the application as it is, right? So far so good. So far so good. We also look at the bonus point input cheat sheets, right? With the text inputs and so on and so forth, text input variants, the text area. Again, all of this now follow is the same format here. So you get the value, so you define a piece of information that you want to remember or store to keep track of, and what you want to do after that, all right? Some of the gadget with using the user state, which is avoid to pass is always defined as an input, a default value. If you pass now a function, this is going to run only on the first render, right? Again, dealing with attributes like this, so radio buttons here. So you define is the legend and your inputs and the label and so on and so forth. So when you click here, you're now able to detect that, right? Exactly. This is now how you can, when it comes to radio button, there is a lot of attribute to keep in mind, and here's a table to summarize this. Exactly. So this is now okay. The input cheat sheet for text, something that we know how to deal with, which is value and unchanged. Some gotchas here. So always you might, if you don't define the value, you might run into some edge cases in text inputs variant, for example here. All right. The other is a text area. How do you now detect that? So in the text area, again, it follows the same format as the input. The other is the radio buttons, that if you have now a particular interface or patterns to interact with, all right? So the idea is to globally unique identifier for this radio button, used to improve the accessibility and usability. So the name is to group a set of radio buttons here, like this. Okay. So the name is to group a set of radio buttons or checkboxes. The value is used to see, hey, what is the thing that you want to collect from that? Because when I detect a change using the onChange, I do want to now set these radio buttons to true, right? And iterative control examples. That's interesting because here you can define as this list of inputs, right? So valid language. So you define this list of inputs, and as long as the you define this list of inputs. So as long as these values, and remember the name must be the same to group all of these inputs, but as long as this is as long as this value, I don't know where is pulling all of this data here. Yeah, because there you got it. Exactly, it's this one, right? So as long as this valid language, or aka values, are attached to the input and described next to that the label, but again, as long as the ID, which is a way of how you can uniquely identify and bind that to that particular layer, as long as the ID and the name, so as long as the ID is specific to that radio or checkboxes, and the names are used to describe a subgroup of radio or checkboxes. So when you detect a change, by getting the value here and update that proper state, you will now be able to update that using is the check property, right? And then you get this and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So the first letter here, this is browser's behavior. So the first letter in a radio button here is actually put the first letter as that. That is a very specific edge cases. Very specific edge cases. Um. mm, mm. Very specific edge cases here. Very specific edge cases. Because here you need to check if, oh, exactly. Avoid to use the same name here, because otherwise you might run into some issues because the name is exactly, some of this issue is shadowing. Mm. Mm. All right. Okay. All right. All right. And the other is the check boxes here. Mm-hmm. Or multiple check. This is for radio button. When you want to iterate control examples of radio button. And the other is this single check boxes. Mm-hmm. Single check boxes like this. Mm-hmm. Single check boxes. So now the value here is that you're gonna. Mm-hmm. But again, when working with radio and check boxes, the value is what is determined what you want to do here, right? Whether it's to rendering as a list of rendering and select a single element in a group, or between two values here. Mm-hmm. Or when you want to now select a multiple checkboxes. Mm-hmm. So in the case of, instead of checkbox, you say is radio button, type box, checkbox. You say type radio. It allows you to select is multiple of them. All right. But it's interesting because now radio is not allow you to uncheck this, unlike now a checkbox where it allows you to uncheck that. You have to be careful with this. So this is how do you now is group multiple checkboxes example here, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Multiple checkbox examples here. With radio button, we can fit everything we need to know in a single string. Here, we don't pass is the same name for this, right? Because if we say, hey, I do want to now say this, we are now telling here, say, all of this will be part of the group. So you are only allowed to select is one. You say group, right? Group check box. So if you say this is on radio, of course it only allows you to select is only one. You see? But again, because this doesn't work that way. But in any case, the TLDR is that radio buttons are for one single option, okay, among several ones, and checkboxes is for several options. That's the main case of this. And here, if you want to define is, okay, if you want to define now here like this, all right, which is usually what we're going to do here. If you want to define now is a series of elements. Let's go into with this, right? This is our end state. Okay, this is our end state. Let's do this. This is our end state, right? I don't know why this not even show me anymore things. Exactly, this is the end state, right? So if I get rid of all of this, if I get rid of all of this, and only I do have this, right? So how will you do this? So, all right, so let's now start with the basics. All right, to define is now this form as it is. So we can say, hey, I just start with the markdown, all right, which is now a form, similar for here, a form. I just want to start the markdown here. Define now is the other properties, which is legend, that is selected toppings, all right, selected toppings, and then I do want to dynamically generate these inputs, right? So what I can do is I'm going to store this piece of information here, okay, in a use state from React, which is initial toppings, all right. This will give me now is a tuple of, it's gonna call this toppings and set toppings, right? And after that, I do want to render is this. So to render collections, you say, hey, it's going to map over each one of those elements of the topping, all right? And then I do want is to now render here is this input type, this is checkbox, okay, checkbox, right, followed by the value, which is the value it is as the topping, all right. because I want, this is now a checkbox, so I don't want to group anything here, so I leave that as it is. And but what I do want is to have now a label next to this option, right? That I do want is to wrap this element in a fragment. Okay, so I want to do this for optimization, so I don't want to create is a particular elements to pollute the DOM, so no, I want React now create me this for me. Okay, and then now show is the topping, right? Topping is not a map function on the initial. Okay, exactly. So topping is not a map function. You're right. Damn right. So I do want is to convert. Exactly. So I do want is to now iterate through that object and get that. So let's get into this. Say, hey, this object, for this object, I want to is get the okay, good. Okay. So what am I going to do here? Because I do want to render this as a collections of values. So whether I transform each one of them, whether I transform that into an array, okay, which allow me to, which is say, hey, I want to transform this into an array where each one of those elements has this object and this another object and this so on and so forth. So that will be one way. So I do have this. So instead of having this topping here as it is, as a plural, right? This in fact will be my, okay, this is the state that I want to keep track of. All right, and when I do this, so what is the problem what is the problem here? Is I do have different data structures. I have different data structures, and one doesn't work with this kind of operations, but I do want to do this. So I do need to find ways to transform this into an iterable object, something like that, right? So and here I need to is only to store is the topping here, right? I need to store is only the topping here. Okay, I need to store it. Okay, so what am I gonna do is, because I just want to store this piece of information here. For example, like anchovies. All right. This is what the piece of information I want to store initially. And I do want is to now create this, in other words, this token. Okay, I do want to create now this via the object dot keys. All right, to only get is the keys of this initial tokens, right? Object dot keys, so get me only the keys of this. No, it's object dot keys. Initial topping is not defined. Exactly, toppings. Initial toppings. That's right, the identifier. So now rendering all of these elements, right? It's not going to select anything. So this actually doesn't work. That's fine. So it wants to render is all of this, right? Since I want to render is one next to each other, I might do something like this. All right, to render this one next to each other. Add some space here, or in this case is that add some space here, right? Or just like this is to add some space here, right? You may want to add some space here, something like that. Or you might want to say, hey, let's going to now add this. All right, so now you're able to add this white space here. Its rendering is a space here. And so now that I render that, right, and I have the toppings here, I do want is to is is to say on change, right? So get me is the event, and now let's go to destructure this to say the target and yeah, the target, right? And then destructure this target to get the so one way to do this is to say, hey, I got the event, and then on this event I can get the structuring is the target, and the structure is the target here with the value, right? Where here I want to get, so what am I doing here? Good question. So I want to destructure this to say target, right? To say target here, and then on the line say is I'm gonna call this function here, but this case with the value, and yeah, let me is console the log here, the value here. Oh, because it's like this. Exactly. So if I check this, and anytime that I do this here, I'm not getting is the value, no problem. So one way that I can do this is the event and pass down to the so what I'm doing here is just to get the target. All right, and then that once you get the target, target dot value here. So what I'm doing here is this. I just want to the structure is that. So again, part of the JavaScript. Part of the JavaScript. Let me the structuring is this. And passing is now the event dot target dot value. All right. To, or you can just simply do this. Structure into the target, right? And I want to now is just console log this to see if this works as expected. And as you can see, you get that, right? Now, so anytime that this value now match on the check property, anytime that this value now match the tokens with, in this case, we're gonna call this option. All right. So option to avoid any shadowing. So anytime now the option is the same as the token, well, this is the value. I do want this to check this as it is, right? So show now the options, and I do want to bind this input with the label via the name here, which is, in our case, I was gonna call this the ID. All right, which is called the option, and the same for here. And there you go, right? Now it is binding to the name. So name is option. No, does not. That's interesting. Oh, because it's HTML 4 exactly, it's binding with the ID. It's binding with the ID. Okay, but it's not setting the value here. That's what happened. It's not setting the value. So if I do this, I can say set token to the option, or in this case is the target dot value. So when I detect that change, I'm going to select that property as it is, you know. So far so good, but it's using the HTML4 that is bind to the ID, right? So okay, what if I want to now render is this as it is a store state? in this case, this is right after the form, so I can say is that this is a right after the form. This is a div. All right, and here you say, all right, now let's going to show this as it is, which is now is showing this object. All right, so this object now is no longer being updated, because what we're doing is just to update is here, not the object in itself, right? Not the object in itself. So what I'm doing is just to only update is the topping of this, right? But not the object in itself. So if I want to update that piece of information here, okay, I can say, hey, let define is this as the initial toppings, because I do want to now keep track of that state. This is, you can call this topping option, or just like this, and here you can say toppings in plural, and set toppings as it is. So toppings here is going to now keep track of this object, right? M, because this is an object, it's a no, toppings has already been declared. So let me call here is now, so the topping, set toppings, and you can call this topping options. All right, so topping options here, and then down below I do want is to now render is the object is the toppings here as entry, right? So one way to do this is to, hey, I just want to run this function. So JSON stringify the toppings. All right, exactly. So JSON stringify this topping and show them in that particular as an object like JSON, right? So the one is to transform is this object dot keys, and then now object dot keys or dot entries from the JSON stringify as it is. Oh, what am I doing here? It's just to show this topping as it is, and then you can pass some label, something like that. No. So, but in any case, this is how I actually show is in this value. And if I want to sync those values, right, I must need to not only update the set toppings, but also is the topping in itself. In other words, to create now a new state, say toppings, say new toppings, okay. Yeah, new toppings. New toppings. This will be now is the toppings, but I do want to create now a new object, spread all of these elements, and update is the specific topping to that, which is that target, all right, which is the property, that target, which is the property, or in this case that value. If I want to make it much more easy to go with, I can say, hey, it's going to define this icons of the topping, right? I say now this is now the topping, all right, and then for that specific topping, I do want is to get the value to and shift that, which is the topping that value, or in this case is the toppings of that value, right? I want to shift that as it is, right? So what I'm doing here is this. Hey, I do want is to now is create a new object, right? Where the key is, so where now the key of the topping, if you match that dynamically, well, I do want is to get that topping and toggle that value here. This is it. And finally you say, okay, so this will be the new topping, and let's going to update that. Here we can say topping, okay, set topping, yeah, set topping, set topping, and then set toppings in plural. You say new toppings here. So here's the thing. So when I click here, it's going to now update the proper value, and so on and so forth. The problem is that because it's not updating the proper value, here we only want to do that once. All right. So it's shifting properly. Now, how do we solve this issue that we have here? That is now in a wonky state. You know, it's not actually keep tracking of that. It's on a wonky state here. So what we can do is because this only allows to update is one elements at a time. So anytime that we create all of this topping, that's interesting. I cannot uncheck that. That's BS. That's BS. I can uncheck that. But again, here I'm only is able to select one of them. So great. What I can do here is to anytime that it creates this new state, these new toppings, okay, So all of this topping will have this value as false. All right. So all of these topics will have its value as false, and only that will be updated properly. So what I can do is, hey, this new topping, all of these topping keys and values will be now false. So set them all to false. That's interesting. So set them all to false, and then update the proper one as it is. So in other words, how do you do that? Is like set all of them to false, right? There might be some ways to not have to do so, right? Or that doesn't allow you to change that. Exactly. So something like this. So there is no need to change that. Okay. Here I'm creating is this, and with the value of So another thing is this. So I can use this to set the value of that, right? But again, we actually select all of this. So this is not what we want. All right. So what I can do is to check this condition. What are you doing? Check if this condition is true. Okay. And if it is, well, update the proper state there. Because what we're doing is just to shift toggle it between one and another. You know, it's toggling. But here we are not toggling effectively. What we're saying is that set that, get the value out of this, and if that value, which is the topping, if that value actually is the which is the option here, or the exactly, if that value, if the topping is so again, what I do need to do is to set all the properties to false, okay, and then update only that. This is one way of how can I do this. Okay. Okay. So how do you do that? Okay. Well, I can go and iterate through all of these elements here, set all of them to false, and only that one is do so. Or I can create is a clone. All right. In this case, I can say, hey, the new topping will be is now all of this as false, and only that it will change. So when I refresh this, it's like I check this. I don't know why this. Okay. Exactly. I check this. I don't need to change that from one state to another. I only set that to true. And anytime that now, well, okay, let's do true. That's right. All right. So when I reload this, so this actually only check that, and anytime I update that state, it's gonna get is only one and only one and only one and only one. But again, I do have now an initial state, and then I refresh all of this. So this is how do I achieve this kind of behavior. This is great for small set of data. Now, but if your object is huge, well, and by huge I mean it must have at least like 1,000 keys or more. So now you have a different kind of problem. You know, you have a different kind of problem. But again, this is how things actually will work here. So this is our solution, all right, of how do I create this, which to me was quite interesting. Let me do this, and let me see how now I did this here, right? Exactly, topping list. Get me all the keys here. That's right, and also is the initial toppings. So here is now iterating through this list, all right, and is going to check for that pixel topping, and if this is true, it's going to check that, and then update that pixel topping of it is. So you say, hey, I'm going to look at the pixel toppings, okay, that I have this initial state, okay, and I'm only going to now trigger, and I'm going to verify if the value and that is true. All right, I want to set this before the onChange. For the onChange, it say, hey, let me get the pizza there. Let me get the pizza there. So here I do have two values here, because I'm setting is the topping here and setting the toppings here. So actually I'm not using is topping at all in this case. I'm not using toppings at all. So this is not yeah, no, I'm not using is toppings at all. Or at least particularly the topping. Okay. All right. Look at this. Okay. So here's the deal. I do already have this object with this key value pairs of true values. So what I'm saying is that I need to somehow transform that into a collection, and then render them in a proper way. But when I need to check this, I say, hey, if this option is the same as this value that is in this specific element, which is the toppings, they say pizza toppings. I will prefer to be more explicit about pizza toppings. and set pizza toppings. All right. So what I'm doing here is that this pizza toppings here, which is the object, is say, hey, is this pizza toggling? If this value is the same, all right, as the pizza topping here. So if this option is the same as the pizza, okay, as as the pizza option. All right. Toppings, of course, change because now it is called pizza toppings, right? If this value is the same, I'm gonna select that. All right. Not only that I'm going to select that, but I will need to create this. In fact, I can, but I will need to create this. Okay. And in fact, what I can create here is this. Is the let's going to use this just for demo purpose and say, hey, let me now when I change update that particularly and set that to true. But here's the deal. I'm going to set that to true. All right. I'm going to set that to true. So if I check this, I'm going to set that to true. But then I need to uncheck that. Right? And then I need to uncheck that. And then I need to uncheck that. Oh, it is based on the value that I'm receiving here. So I need to uncheck that. So based on this value here, I'm going to now is set the pizza toppings and now creates a new object that contains the pizza toppings right? And only that specific property, which is the option in our case, right? I do want is to now set the value to that, which is event.target.check. Not the value, is the check. Okay. So I'm creating is at that moment I'm creating is a new snapshot of this pizza topping. All right. Initially everything is false, and then when I update that, which is chicken, for example, anchovies. With anchovies, I'm going to set that, but with the true value from the check. Okay. So yes, it is setting as true. It's not, check that out, which is pretty fucked up. Is the option is the same as the e.target okay. No, because I don't want here. This is not the value. Here, this is the property here. Here I'm getting is the value, and I do want is to get is the key out of this. So because here I just want to check if this value is true. So if this value at this position is true, so show that. Okay? So show that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Holy moly. All right. I didn't quite follow that behavior because what I'm doing here is to set the pixel okay. So what I'm doing here is to, okay, this is the current state of this is the initial state, and the initial state, everything is false, all right? But what I do want is to now identify the options and update that value, all right? But update this value not based on the value here, okay? It is based on the conditions that I get in here, on the check, all right? So if I select that dynamically, so at the first time, let's say we have the anchovies, right? So when I select the anchovies, which is the key, okay, the anchovies is the key, and the value from the check, not from the value, what represents check is the conditions here. If this is true, I want to check this. Okay, if this is true, I want to check this. If it's not, I don't want to check this. Oh my god. All right, that's okay. It doesn't matter. I don't quite follow. Here's the thing. What do you want to do here? What I want is to somehow is to update that. Okay, I have now this list. I have this map. Okay, but what I do want is to not only transform is all of that into a collection to iterate through, and when I need to update that, I need to look up for that property, and then look up for that property. Yeah, I need to is look up for that property and set the proper value to this. Value from where? From the check. From the check things here. But I'm getting it from the, okay, from the check. Hey, if this is check, good, set this as check. If this is not, so this event actually is capturing that check state or not. Exactly. This actually is capturing the set state or not. So in other words, we are not toggling there. What I'm doing is just receive this data from the input event and then update that properly. Okay, but it's based not on what, not, but it's based not on my own logic. It is based on the, and what is provide here. Okay, so what is provide here? Based on what is provide here. And here I'm going to update that specific with the value that I'm getting from. All right. Okay. So now I'm going to update with the value that is specific based on that based on that, okay, I'm going to react based on that. So, okay, if I do this, I can actually see this much more clearly. Okay. So, I want to exactly, because what I did is just before, but what I was trying to do before is trying to update based on the value. But what the value represents in this case is the event dot target value. What this value represents is the option, right? So it doesn't make sense to attach this because this is a different value. But what I do want to check if that value, all right, is the same as the option, all right, as the selected option, which is kind of redundant because you're checking is the value in it itself. But what you can do here is to say, hey, give me is now is the value that I'm getting from the check state. Because before I was trying to do is this, but event of value and the options are the same. So if the value that I'm getting from that event is the same as the option, okay, so now set this to true. So evaluate this and now set this to true. But if it's not, now set this to false. But the thing is that it doesn't work. It worked for true, but it doesn't work for false. You know? So one way to do this is to say, hey, Boolean value. So evaluate this. Is the value that I'm getting is the same as the option, which is kind of redundant. You have the same value, but here I do want is to get is the value that I'm getting from the target, which is a check. What is the current value at that moment? And if I do this, it stringify this. Okay, JSON stringify of null of that, which is, I can say is JSON stringify null and the level of that. But again, if I do this, okay, you have now a specific way to show this, known as the output here. Interesting, very, very interesting. Okay, very, very interesting stuff here. So, but in any case, going this. Okay, but in any case, I do think this was quite revealing, this exploration, today's video, and that'll be all. Take care. Bye bye.